Hello, it's Tessa. Today I'm going to be painting this poodle, but first I want to talk a bit about how to paint texture and show you one of my methods for practicing a new texture before jumping into my final painting. What I do to simplify textures is focus on the silhouette and the terminator line. You can think of the silhouette as the outline of your main shape. To show texture, the outline of our subject needs to reflect that. If you start with a simple shape of your subject, you can use a more refined line to cut into and out of that shape. The terminator line is the point where light turns into shadow. If I draw a curved terminator line on this circle, it shows how light is hitting my shape and adds a curved form to turn it into a sphere. If I add the same curved line to my circle with a textured silhouette, it fights with the impression of texture. The moment I change this shadow line to mimic the texture drawn in the silhouette, it can help trick the brain into thinking the whole object is made of the same thing. One more thing that took me a long time to address in my paintings is to be mindful of my value changes. It's easy to go overboard in the light side of our subjects and add tons of details with a darker paint. Looking at a reference image, we start to focus in on all the separate forms within a texture and add little shadows to each of these forms. Counterintuitively, this flattens the image and turns it into more of a pattern than a texture. Since these smaller forms are still on the light side of our subject, light is bouncing around throughout all these little forms, effectively killing any true shadows within. I make sure any marks I'm adding to the lit side are only a little bit darker than what's already there. Since this texture is one I'm less familiar with, I want to practice before starting my painting. I really like practicing new concepts on spheres, since it helps me consider light and form without adding complicated shapes into the mix. I drew a few circles here to practice. On this first circle, I go in straight with paint without drawing anything. Painting from one side to the next, I fill in my circle, making sure to flick some paint outside the circle to indicate the curls sticking out. I charge in a little darker paint, where I will later add my shadow shape. Once this circle is completely dry, I take some very diluted paint to map out where I want the curls to be. I make sure to keep it light, since I want these areas to be the lightest on my shape. I stop about where I imagine the terminator line to be. Once these marks are dry, I can go in with a darker shadow color and negative paint around the curls I just created. I'm starting to realize that this is getting fussy and tedious, and it's hard to see the marks I made. So I give up and move on to my next practice. I think I could have pushed this technique and made it work, but there's only so much time I want to spend shading spheres when my actual painting is waiting for me. On this next circle, I decide to use a pencil to map out where I want my edges and individual curls to be.
It's hard to see all the things that you could never be.
After drawing all the curl shapes on the lit side, I follow the same steps as the first circle.
But never was. How it hurts to know.
I add a third layer, making even darker marks for curls on the shadow side. Instead of negative painting on this side, I use my marks to indicate the curl shapes. I'm pretty happy with this technique and how it looks, but it was more tedious than I had in mind. I'd explore this more for paintings where the texture is the focus, but for this poodle portrait, I think it would require a lot of time and attention to a part of the dog that I don't want to highlight. Now I'm feeling warmed up, and I have a better idea of what I'm going for. Instead of drawing curl shapes all over the circle, I focus on creating them right along the terminator line. Instead of just a single zigzaggy line, I draw a couple rows of curls, hoping that this can act as a more gradual transition from light to shadow. Once I'm happy with the drawing, I paint using the same steps as before.
To know.
Instead of negative painting in the whole light side, I add very diluted swirly, scribbly marks. This is just to add some variation in the shape, without creating any extra shadows or forms that would distract from the overall effect.
To know.
I could practice like this forever, but at a certain point, you just have to decide to jump into the painting you've been prepping for. I lay out my sketch in pencil, making sure I get a silhouette I'm happy with, place the features, and draw the curl shapes along the areas I see where light and shadow meet.
You said about the things you said. The slowness creeps towards my feet within the light the morning brings to clean the
I'm using a limited color palette of burnt umber, ultramarine, and permanent rose. Blue and brown is one of the quickest ways to mix a soft gray, and I just picked the rose color to add a little interest. I start by mixing a watery gray and watery pinkish gray, then a more pigmented mix of each of these colors. Using my two watery mixes, I fill in the entire shape of the portrait. While these are still wet, I charge in my more pigmented mixes into the shadows. I soak up any puddling before letting this layer dry.
summer came for us and showed us what we lost. I'm riding to myself.
I start my next layer with my diluted mixes, painting in some of the subtle mid-tone and shadow shapes on the poodle's muzzle. This short hair has its own texture, which I try to create by using very short strokes at the edges of my larger shapes. I also add some singular fine lines fading out from these larger shapes, trying to follow the direction the poodle's hair is growing. I move straight from the muzzle into the neck, which has more tightly curling hair. On the light side of the neck, I use a scribbling, scumbling motion to create the look of curls.
A memory you can't deny.
Then I move into the shadow side and fill the rest of the neck in with a solid, darker color. I want to wait for the neck to dry before painting the ear, so I move back to the face to deepen some of the shadows near the eye and chin.
Came for us.
Now it's time to move to the curly head, which fits more of the practice techniques I was working on. I see the poodle's hair as having two main forms, the front and top bangs, and then the ear and back of the head. Working in layers and bouncing between the features and forms, I try to bring out this curly hair texture.
Summer came for us.
The ear has more defined curls, so I use the dilute paint to add some subtle curl shapes to the lit side. I'm pretty happy with how the ear turned out, but I don't really think I captured the curl shape at the top of the head, where light and shadow meet. This area was a challenge because it served as the shadow for the top of the head, but then blended into the lit side of the ear. I'm okay having parts of a painting that I don't like. By noticing it and naming it, I can bring that critique into my next paintings and hopefully learn from it. The last step in most of my paintings is to add gouache. I love watercolor softness and blendability, but when I get to the end of my paintings, I want some more sharpness and contrast. Gouache is perfect for this type of painting, as it is more opaque and is much better suited to being applied thickly. After adding my highlights and darkest shadows to the features, I'm calling this poodle done. What do you think? I hope this video gave you some insight on how to tackle complicated textures and inspires you to practice something new in your own paintings. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.